Latin America is the fastest part of the world to get a second citizenship, with anyone being able to obtain dual citizenship in as little as 2 years. And some people being able to get it as soon as immediately. Today, I'm going to tell you the fastest places in Latin America where anyone can get dual citizenship. What's great about Latin America is it's a very open part of the world. For example, if you're going to give birth, almost every country in the Americas will give your child citizenship just because they were born there. You can't say that about most parts of Europe, almost anywhere in Asia or Africa. It is a culture of immigrants, and therefore people moving and becoming citizens by naturalization is pretty straightforward. And while many countries do require you to learn their language, most countries in Latin America speak Spanish, which is a relatively straightforward language to learn. And theoretically, you could accumulate multiple citizenships around Latin America just by learning that one language. So we're going to go through some places where you can get citizenship in as little as 2 years, and under certain circumstances where you can get it immediately. What's also interesting about Latin America before we get into the list is that you might be surprised at the quality of the passports. Chile's passport, for example, is a legitimate Tier A passport. You can go visa-free to the US, to Canada, to Australia, and to New Zealand. And because Chile is a more neutral country than those Western countries, you can also go to places like Russia. So you've got arguably an even more powerful passport than an American does. Argentina's passport, not quite as good in terms of access to the US, but pretty darn good around the world. We've talked about Mexico being one of the best passports in the world outside of the traditional Western world. Brazil, great passport. And what's interesting is many of these countries don't have the stigma, don't have the reputation, or the stereotype. I mean, who doesn't like the Brazilians? Who doesn't like the Chileans or the Uruguayans or the Costa Ricans? In many cases, these are more peaceful countries. You can give your children places that are going in the right direction. I think Mexico or Argentina even could be much better countries 10 or 20 years from now. Even countries like El Salvador and Nicaragua have really good passports. You can travel to the UK, you can travel to Europe, you can travel to a lot of places around the world, even if you can't travel to the US. So you've got fast, you've got easy enough to deal with, and you've got a decent passport in the end. That's not a bad combination. The downside of Latin America is that countries like Paraguay, countries like Ecuador have made physical presence more of a consideration in terms of getting naturalized. There aren't as many what are called paper residences in Latin America as there used to be, where you could just keep the residence permit and then apply for citizenship later. You've got countries like Uruguay, countries like Argentina, which have this civil law system where judges get involved in citizenship decisions, which arguably makes it more flexible. But for someone from a country where you're used to, knowing what the rules are and choosing to follow them or not, it brings things to where there's less certainty. So now let's get to the list. Assuming you have no special circumstances, you're just the average Joe coming and getting a residence permit in Latin America, how long does it take to get citizenship? The one thing you have to consider is that these timelines are when you can apply for citizenship. And so the country might take 6 months, 12 months. Some might take longer. We'll talk about that as we go. Argentina, 2 years. So new president in Argentina, a lot of people are very excited about that. If you go and live in Argentina for the better part of 2 years, you can then apply for naturalization. You can go through the process of becoming a citizen. Dominican Republic, also 2 years. They've got a fast track option. If you invest $200,000 in the country, you can potentially even speed that up a little bit further as an investor. Argentina's passport, substantially better than the DR. Sometimes having a lower quality passport, if you already have a good passport, is a nice hedge. But Argentina, arguably, pound for pound, the best quality of passport to timeline at 2 years. Dominican Republic as well. Peru is 2 years. That's one where I think it's written on the tin, but not really followed. What we've seen in Peru for years now is they'll prescribe for investors a certain amount to invest, but then actually we want it to be more, we don't know how much more. I love Peru, the country, best food in Latin America. Not sure I am going there. That said, there are people who live there full time who are getting citizenship within a few years. It's just not what I would necessarily put all my stock in. Bolivia, 3 years. That's one where you have to live there. Bolivia is probably the one country in South America. We do research on all these things from tax and residence and citizenship and banking. Bolivia is the one country that I'm fascinated by, but doesn't really offer any flags at all. You've got to live there. There's no special tax exemption like you'd have in some of the other countries. They don't have low taxes. So you've just got to want to live in Bolivia. And quite frankly, I think the politics are probably different there than a lot of nomad capitalists are looking for. Honduras is 3 years, one of the more flexible citizenship programs. We recently clarified some stuff on dual citizenship there in terms of they have restrictions on who can have dual citizenship, and realize it's actually much less restrictive than we had thought for some time. So Honduras is an interesting option. What we tell people is, for any time you have to spend there, look at Roatan in the Caribbean. It is an island. People speak English. A lot of expats go there, and you are safe from the mainland, where obviously there's been a lot of chaos in recent years. Paraguay is 3 years. They've made it less flexible in terms of you should be spending some time in Paraguay. Very interesting, low tax place. Now, keep in mind, you don't have to apply for citizenship exactly after 3 years. You could apply after 4 years, after 5 years. And so in Latin America, most countries have an option where you just show you have some kind of income. You don't necessarily have to invest in many of these countries, or if you do in a country like in Ecuador, for example, it's a rather nominal investment, $40,000. Some countries, it's $30,000. We're not talking about big money here. And so if you invest, or if you show that income, and you get a residence permit to keep in your back pocket as a plan B, a plan C, a plan D, maybe you get a couple of them. We're recommending that to our clients in many cases. You can say, hey, I might have to live in Paraguay part of the year to get that citizenship. I'm not ready to do that, but maybe I'll keep the residence permit for 2 years, and 2 years from now, I'll decide to go, and I'll spend a little bit of time in Paraguay. And so then I'm applying in 5 years, but I kept that optionality all along. And so in that way, you can get a handful of Latin American residence permits and then figure out what you want to do. But if something bad happens, if you ever want to move, if you want to lower your taxes, if a war starts, who knows what could happen, you've got multiple places to go. And so a country like Paraguay that does want a little bit of physical presence now, you don't have to apply for 3 years, but you can keep that residence permit. You invest a 5-figure amount, or you just show them a little bit of income, and you get in, and you at least start the clock ticking. Brazil is 4 years, very interesting country. They have some investor visa options. Nicaragua, 4 years. I would argue that in most cases you're looking at 5. However, I would argue there's a fast track in Nicaragua if you're making an investment, if you do spend some time in the country, and if you speak Spanish. You could get that down by a couple of years. So I would argue Nicaragua for the average person is a little bit longer than 4 years. For some people could be as short as 2 years or so. Belize, 5 years, interestingly enough, part of the Caribbean community, the same Caribbean community that the citizenship by investment programs like St. Lucia, which I did, are part of, but not nearly as good of a passport as St. Lucia, St. Kitts and Nevis, etc. And so Belize, actually helped somebody get Belize citizenship by descent. I'm not convinced people who live there are getting it in 5 years. I'm not convinced Belize is the best place to do too many things. I think it's one of those kind of overhyped countries. Doesn't mean it's bad, just means it gets more hype than it should. I'm not sure that the 5 years works, and the passport probably not worth it. Chile, 5 years. There have historically been decent tax incentives in Chile. Obviously, the government has become more left-leaning recently, but has historically been a decent option to live, work towards citizenship. Great citizenship to get if you actually want to live there. I find, like most southern South American countries, with the exception of Argentina, Chile to be a little dry. Colombia, 5 years. Actually just did some research and clarified the exact process for Colombian citizenship. I know a number of people who've gotten it within about a year after applying. There's different, levels of Spanish required depending on where you apply. Generally, I think my experience there has been that if you speak Spanish better, you can apply somewhere where it comes faster, maybe 6 months. Otherwise, maybe you spend 12 to 15 months waiting after your 5 years, and the Spanish requirements aren't quite as high, but pretty simple. In Colombia, like many of these countries, you take a test, you answer some questions in Spanish. If you pass, then they generally issue you the citizenship. But it's 5 years. And there is some flexibility in terms of physical presence. If you missed the permanent residence program and for investors where you had to spend 1 day per year the entire time, that was a great deal. It's one reason why I say when there's good residence programs, take advantage of them. But Colombia, 5 years, and I think generally speaking, you'll need to spend 2 years there. Not necessarily as a taxpayer, but 2 of those 5 years I think you'll need to spend in the country. Okay, Cuba, no one should want to be Cuban. That's going to be a red flag. Ecuador, some call it 5 years. I would argue get that a little bit faster than that. El Salvador, 5 years. They launched this new $1 million Bitcoin investment project. I don't think that's worth it. If you want to go and live in El Salvador because you are a Bitcoiner and you think it's the future, 5 years there. 5 years in Guatemala. They've got an option for more flexible fiscal presence. Mexico is 5 years. Great residence program to get. We talked to a lot of our clients about adding Mexico residents. We've been talking to folks more recently about Argentina. There's some others in Central America we recommend where you don't really have to be there. If you want to go and live in Mexico, you do need to put in 2 years on the ground in Mexico. But you can start the clock ticking and then decide later whether you want it or not. And at least, if nothing else, you end up with a permanent residence program. Panama, 5 years. I would argue that a lot of people are not getting it at all, let alone in 5 years. So much like Malta in the European Union, they say 5 years. Really, it's 18. I don't know too many people getting it in Panama in 5 years. Suriname, 5 years. Uruguay, 5 years. That can be reduced to 3 if you're there with a family. That's one where I think definitely you want to spend a good amount of time. Costa Rica, I think generally speaking about 7 years. Good passport to have. Venezuela, one you probably shouldn't be considering, and that is 10 years. Now, a couple ways to reduce that. If you're married to a citizen, Argentina, Dominican Republic, Honduras, you can pretty much apply immediately. The residence requirement is waived. Belize, Brazil, 1 year. Colombia, Costa Rica, El Salvador, Mexico, 2 years. Nicaragua, I think, is also 2 years. Now, that Mexico, you're basically bringing up the physical presence requirements. So the 3 years where you don't really need to be there are gone, but the 2 years where you do need to be there remain. So you're just cutting out the fluff in Mexico if you're married to a citizen. Many other countries do not have any special provisions for spouses. Now, what if you are the parent of a citizen? That could be by adoption. It could also mean that you were giving birth and you decided to go and take advantage of citizenship by birth. The citizenship of the soil that is common in Latin America and very few other countries around the world. Pakistan, Fiji, a few countries with residence permits in Europe. If you have a child, Argentina, again, residence waived. Brazil is 1 year. That's one you've heard talked about a lot. Marry a Brazilian, give birth to a Brazilian or adopt a Brazilian, 1 year to citizenship. Now, again, you may need to be present for part of the timeline when you're applying for naturalization in some of these countries. And so you want to consider the tax consequences of Brazil, for example. You may end up being tax resident in 1 or 2 years. Some of these countries have tax incentives. A few of them have either territorial tax systems, which means foreign income's exempt, or low taxes to begin with, like Paraguay. Ecuador has a 10% regime. Not all these countries have special tax incentives. So if you live there long enough to qualify as a tax resident, it could be 6 months or more. And I think a lot of these countries are relatively strictly a days test, like 183 days. You're going to pay tax. So what's the price of having your worldwide income under a residential tax system taxed if you're in a country like a Brazil or a Colombia, if you have to spend enough time there to be taxed? Some of these countries, you may not have to spend enough time there to be taxed. Some of these countries, you can kind of slide under the 6 months. Some of them, you're going to be substantially less, 1, 2, 3 months per year. Some of them maybe even a day or two a year. And so, Mexico, again, if you give birth to a child, whether your spouse is Mexican and therefore your child's Mexican, or you adopt, or you just give birth there. I mean, Latin America is the place to give birth if you're an expecting parent. So basically, Argentina, Brazil, Mexico are the ones that stand out to me for marriage and for birth. And actually, I didn't know that Argentina basically waived residence requirements. So if you're looking for a spouse, Argentina is apparently the place to go. So that's how you can get citizenship in Latin America. Now, you mentioned we talked about the tax consequences. For me, if you're earning a high income or if you have a high net worth, that's something that you have to keep in mind. Nomad Capitalist understands that. We help people put together tax-friendly strategies that allow you to get residence permits. Again, I'd be looking at getting a couple of these. I have multiple residence permits around the world, and maybe that turns into multiple citizenships around the world, or maybe some of them pay off into citizenship, maybe all of them. But having multiple residence permits and citizenships is the name of the game. We can help you figure out which ones work. We can help you figure out what actually works in reality. I mentioned Peru, for example. That's the consequence of actually doing this stuff, of actually having an extensive network, of actually doing testing on the stuff that we research, rather than just saying, well, the law says this. Some countries, they don't really follow their own laws that well. They may make it more difficult, or they also may be more flexible. So you have to understand what the realities on the ground are. You want to do things very legitimately, but you want to understand how the countries work. And so we can help you put together a residence permit portfolio, make sure that wherever you do spend time is tax-friendly. If you want to move to Latin America, again, a trifecta method where you live 4 months a year in 3 different countries could work. And if you're doing business in North America, the time zone's going to work out perfectly for you. So that's a benefit for people who are from the US and Canada in particular. So it's possible, 4 months in 3 different countries, that could lead to 3 different passports in the matter of 3, 4, 5 years, and that could be a more tax-friendly way to go than just living in one place full time. If you're not ready to leave your country yet, we can advise you on how long you should go and spend in these other countries. So there's a whole bunch of strategies, but what you're trying to do is to protect yourself, have options, and get that second passport very affordably. If you want to go to nomadcapitalist.com, we'll be happy to help you learn how to do that and build your residence and passport portfolio.